Welcome, and thank you for joining us for this episode of our webinar series on best practices in e-discovery. My name is Jeff Fugit. I'm Vice President of Sales and Marketing for Lexby, and I'll be your moderator for today's event. Today's event is focused on best practices in early case procedures for accelerated review. With the exponential growth of electronically stored information and emerging challenges like the increase of cross-border discovery, combined with the compressed timeframe allowed for discovery, really creates an accelerated review imperative. We'll start with a little background information on Lexby. We're an 11-year-old, fast-growth, cloud-based provider of DIY e-discovery processing and document review software, and we're based in Austin, Texas. We offer one of the industry's fastest ESI document processing and data conversion services and handle a vast range of file types, including Macintosh files, Office 365, SharePoint, social media, all email types. We also provide language translation services. Before we get started, I've got a few housekeeping rules. You've been placed in a listen-only mode to prevent background noise from interfering with the presenters. In the event you have an issue, please email us at webinars@lexby.com and we'll address the issue right away. Also, if you have a question, please enter it into the Q&A portion of the web conference interface and we'll follow up with you after the webinar. Joining us today is Andrew Hansel. He is an attorney with Fager, Baker & Daniels, where he is the e-discovery consulting manager. He has more than 10 years experience as a litigator in private practice and in-house counsel. As a member of Fager, Baker & Daniels Client Technology Solutions Group, Mr. Hansel advises clients in all aspects of e-discovery best practices and services. To help provide some context for Andrew and to the audience's perspective on this topic, we'd like to ask for your participation with a couple of quick polling questions before we get started. Our first polling question: what has been or do you expect could be your biggest challenge in reducing data sets to achieve e-discovery timelines and budget goals? Establishing collection criteria, processing capabilities and limitations, efficient review practices? Love to get your answer on that one. Okay, I'll close that poll. And our second question, approximately how many document-intensive cases do you handle each year? And while you're answering that, I'll take this time to thank you for participating in our polling questions. Okay, we'll go ahead and wrap up this question. And with that, I'll hand the presentation over to Andrew Hansel. Andrew?
Well, thank you for that introduction, and welcome to today's webinar on early case procedures for accelerated review. As we start today, I'm going to kind of walk through what our goals for today are going to be. I'm hoping that this presentation will be a good high-level look for you at the decisions you can make early in a case to set up a successful e-discovery project. A little bit about myself. I have practiced in product liability and employment litigations for 8 years. I have been in-house counsel for a couple of years. I worked in the e-discovery area for the past 7 years, running managed review and collection operations, and I currently run Fager, Baker Daniels e-discovery program. So just an outline of what we'll talk about today. It's a very high-level presentation covering a lot of topics here that, frankly, could merit their own entire webinar on each part of them. But first, we'll look at kind of goals in e-discovery and what we're trying to accomplish through the decisions we're going to make and the actions we're going to take. We're going to take an overview of collections and how your decisions in the collection process can affect the case later on. Once you've collected that data, we're going to look at ways that we can transmit the data. We're going to evaluate platforms that you can review data in and look at some of the decisions that you'll need to make there in terms of pricing as well as configurations and capabilities. We'll also talk about processing specifications that you'll need to make at the decisions you'll have to make at the outset of a case that are important because they're going to affect the discovery project all the way through, and once made, many of them are very difficult to undo. We're going to look at ways that we can reduce our data set in order to manage the number of documents that we're working with. And lastly, we're going to take a high-level look at technology-assisted review. Again, a topic that definitely merits its own entire webinar, but we'll outline some of the different techniques and tools that are out there that can help you reduce your data set and manage your documents. So e-discovery goals. Our first goals in e-discovery I try to articulate as is to find relevant documents as quickly as possible, as inexpensively as possible, and to comply with our discovery obligations. Our best way to try and do this is to eliminate non-relevant documents as early in the process as possible. Now, there's several opportunities during the e-discovery process to eliminate non-relevant documents. One of them is at collection. Obviously, if a document is never collected that we don't need, then we don't have to deal with it later on. At processing is another opportunity to weed out volumes of documents that are not going to be relevant to what we're looking at. And lastly, in actual document review is obviously when you're making decisions about which documents are going to be a part of your case and which documents are not. One of the things to consider here is the earlier in the process, there's exponential cost savings that you can eliminate documents, right? If you eliminate documents, if you never collect them, then you're not going to process them, you're not going to review them. And if a document does proceed all the way through review, then you're going to have experienced the costs and the time in terms of collection and processing as well. What we want to do here, though, is try to avoid backtracking and delays and costs. And if we make decisions and cut corners early on, we can end up having to go back and redo steps, and ultimately any cost savings that we might have and time savings that we might have made based on those decisions are going to be lost. Some of these can be things like under collecting. If we don't collect, if we filter our data too much at collection, we may end up having to go back if we can. And if the data has been lost since then, we might not ever be able to get it. Decisions in processing, if we process our data incorrectly, we might have to go back and reprocess it and recreate the database, and that's going to be an expensive and time-consuming process. And incorrect review instructions too. If you don't take the time to set out proper instructions to whoever's reviewing your documents, those bad decisions can come back to haunt you in terms of needing to rework and redo that exercise as well. And our last goal here is going to be to find and elevate the most relevant documents. Many cases, whether there are millions of documents or hundreds of thousands of documents or thousands of documents, the real core documents that you're looking for are probably going to be in the hundreds or less. And the sooner that you can find those documents, whether they're good or bad, and elevate those to the legal team and those decision makers, is going to put you in a position to make the best decisions for your client, determine whether you're looking to settle this case, whether you're going to look to move forward in this case. So some of the things we're going to talk about there are search techniques to try and find these documents, and technology-assisted review is another tool that we can use to try and find these documents early on and move them up the chain. So collection, first step of the discovery process. Our first step here is to try and put legal holds in with custodians early and broadly. The earlier we can prevent potential data from being deleted, the better we're going to be in a position to collect that data later. Holds generally as a process are not very costly because you're not actually doing anything other than potentially stopping data from being deleted. So these look like notices to custodians. Now they can be as simple as an email notice or a written memo or that, but nowadays there are also many software solutions out there that will actually automate this process for you, that will generate both automated notices to custodians as well as follow-ups and continuation of the whole notices and that on a periodic basis. And some of these software solutions will actually also integrate with your document platforms and actually help you put electronic holds in place. So if a custodian inadvertently attempts to delete data, or if a custodian's account is potentially going to be eliminated because they've left the enterprise or something like that, that can prevent losses of data in that place as well. Once you've identified and interviewed your custodians, is the next step. If you need to move forward in collection, interviewing your custodians is important mainly to map data locations. Now, most companies are going to have prescribed locations where you are told as an employee you're supposed to be saving and you're supposed to be working in the data that you're using. But many times, unless these are locked down, and even if they are, employees are potentially going to be using locations or devices that are outside of what you're aware of. And the only way to discover these devices is through interviewing these individuals. This can include personal emails and devices, as well as other items. And shared locations is another reason to interview these individuals in terms of, are they or people in their group sharing storage space on a server or other places where they're routinely saving documents. So it's not necessarily a single custodian's documents, and it could miss your collection plan because it's not associated with one particular name, but you would want to make sure that you're collecting from those shared locations as well. And when you move forward with the collection after you've identified these custodians and interviewed them, there's a chance here potentially to filter the data that you're collecting at collection. First question to ask here is can you even do it? A lot of systems potentially will allow you to search and collect this data, but other systems are not designed for it. For example, just running a front-end Outlook client search for data or for terms is not going to be an adequate way to filter data, because the Outlook search engine is not built for e-discovery. There are materials that will be omitted there, specifically unindexed materials that wouldn't be found in that. So you want to use a designed e-discovery tool. Office 365 and Google Vault and Google Takeout are some of those tools that are designed for actually doing e-discovery collection. You may be able to apply certain dates and terms at collection. If you're unaware or if you're unsure of the terms that you're going to ultimately use, you may not want to be filtering at collection, because if your search terms change in any way, if terms are added, you're going to have to potentially go back and recollect that data. And so you may not want to filter by search term at collection unless you're very sure that those terms are going to be static. Dates, however, sometimes dates are much more certain, and it's a good way to potentially cut down on data. Another consideration here is, before you apply any filtering, is this data going to be protected by a litigation hold? Is it, is this part of your company system where we know that this data is not going to be deleted, or is this one of the aforementioned personal emails or devices where you may not have the ability to make sure that that data is either backed up or not deleted, in which case you may want to make sure that you're collecting all of it versus filtering during the collection process. Last point I'll give you here is trying to use tools to assure the defensibility of your collection. One of the most important things that a tool is going to make sure that you do is you want to make sure that you're capturing unindexed and unsearchable content from the system. If you run a search through Outlook, an Outlook client, or through the user interface of Windows, or that you're only searching items that Windows or that Outlook has indexed and is able to search. You're not searching through content that it cannot. So you're going to want to make sure that you're using a tool that's going to capture items that you weren't able to search, so that you can search those later on in the process here when we move forward to processing. Lastly here, avoid what I would call drag and drop collections. It's where you're just copying, without the use of a tool, of items across, maybe into a portable hard drive or something like that to go. This is a main way that metadata gets corrupted or changed. The metadata being things like the last time a file was modified or when it was opened. Often, if you're going to use a drag and drop collection where you're just moving these items and copying them across, you're going to change that date to the date of the collection and potentially spoil your data. So once we have our data collected, the next step is going to be transmitting that data. There's a number of concerns when you're transmitting data. Many times people are going to try and send data over the wire at this point, over internet, but there can be limits in terms of the volume that you can push over the internet. You're going to want to make sure that your data is encrypted. It's important. I think obviously many of us have seen in the news over the past few years, your your Target data breach or your Panama Papers in terms of law firm security in that as well. You want to make sure that your client data is protected and that it's not subject to, if it is somehow lost or misplaced. I'm always reminded here of a newspaper article I saw around dry cleaners, the number of those USB thumb drives that they find in a year. Obviously no one intends to misplace client data or lose track of anything, but if it does, it's reassuring to know that it's encrypted and that whoever hands it it's fallen into, whether they are have any ill intent in mind or not, that they're not going to be able to use that data. And lastly, is going to be making sure that you're keeping a preservation copy of the data you've collected in the event that the data that you're working with is corrupted in some manner or lost through processing or processing goes awry, that you have something to go back to. Internet data transfers, which I think more and more of our data collections are done by, are certainly taking over from devices in most ways to send data onto processing and on to be hosted in a review platform. Typical tools here are either secure file transfer, SFT, or file transfer protocol, FTP. These are good methods because they're password protected. There's credentials associated with them that can make it so that you know that that data is reaching only its intended target and it's only being accessed there. But as we talked about a little bit above, there are limits on size here in terms of how many gigabytes of data you can push across. It's going to depend on the service that you're using and the bandwidth that it has. A tactic here for trying to keep the limits on size is making sure that the data you're transmitting is broken up into smaller pieces rather than trying to send one super large file of that, which may be more likely not to transfer correctly. Another option here can be direct collection from the email systems or that themselves. Office 365 and Google Takeout involved, which are cloud-based services, are designed to have the potential ability to just collect directly by your processor as opposed to the user needing to collect it and then forward it through another means. One consideration here, though, is these services typically require someone to have a system credential in order to be able to do that, take the data out process, and many of your clients may not want to give their law firm or data vendor or other people the system credential that's required to do that, and so the functionality may not be available because they may insist on downloading the data themselves first and then transferring it to you second. Some of these services also throttle this significantly, the ability to take data out, and that may add hours and days to your collection time, depending on how much data you're trying to pull down. And one help here can be third-party collection tools. There are tools out there designed to work with Office 365 and Google that both can accelerate this process and that can allow you to do this direct download from the cloud system itself to the data processor without having to have a middle step where a user on the system or an admin on the system does the collection first. And lastly, in terms of a preservation copy, ideally you want to create 2 copies at the time of collection. There are a number of devices out here that will let you do that so that when you're collecting, there's no doubt that you've collected the exact same type of data, and you can take one of those copies and set it aside and keep it as a preservation copy, and then use the other copy as your working copy to move forward in terms of processing and loading to a review platform. If you're not using a tool that does that, again, I would encourage you before you start processing to create a second preservation copy of the data to make sure that if there is anything that's lost in terms of processing, you're going to be able to go back to what you did collect without having to potentially redo that work and without being worried about any changes in those files if you have to go back. Next year, we were going to talk about evaluating the platforms that you can load this data to. There are obviously a number of databases out there that you can load data to and then review. I often phrase it in terms of kind of relativity versus everything else. Relativity is obviously the largest platform out there in the market, and it's offered through a number of service providers. However, there are a number of other platforms out there that may have specific capabilities that are better or different than Relativity. And so when you're making this decision, you're going to probably be weighing, do I want to use a Relativity provider or one of these other databases based on the features and other capabilities that they may provide. Some of the features that may be important to you, this isn't meant to be an exhaustive list, but certainly something that I've encountered in the past, is the ability to use logic coding rules when you have people reviewing in their database, the ability to set up a coding template so that if certain coding choices are made, for example, if a document is marked as not responsive, that it locks out the ability to put an issue code on that document or things like that. If you have large matters, or if you're using contract reviewers to perform this work, you may want to kind of lock down that functionality, and it can prevent objective coding mistakes being made in terms of documents being miscoded. Automated workflows are another feature that you may see out there. These are the ability for platforms to immediately assign additional documents to reviewers based on their qualifications or based on rules, and also to take documents that have been reviewed and potentially assign them to quality control or quality assurance sets based on predetermined searches and that. Using these, particularly in large matters, can be very effective to limit the amount of project management that you need and to prevent slack and downtime as a result of documents not being spread out evenly between the reviewers and the legal team that's working on the project. And lastly, integrated translation and transcription services are something I've seen used effectively before. One of the advantages of this is you can take audio files or video files that are included in your collection, transcribe the audio of those so that you can potentially apply search terms and that to it, where otherwise these files would be indexed and unsearchable. Similarly, translations, mechanical translations, sometimes can have limited usefulness. I think they're most useful in determining which documents you might need full translations of, but they are a way potentially of applying English search terms to foreign language documents, because you have, if you have rough mechanical translations of them. Another thing when you're evaluating these platforms that you can look for are certain performance certifications that these providers might have that give you some insight into both their data security and their back office performance in terms of the ability of their system to handle your data. One of these that you'll see most often is ISO 27001, which is a data security certification that demonstrates that your provider has met certain requirements in terms of how they protect the security around your data. The new GDPR, or the new EU privacy regulations that are coming into effect, will probably have some sort of certification that will replace the old safe harbor structure. ITAR is another law that relates to the accessing of documents related to U.S. defense contractors and defense manufacturers, and essentially prohibits foreign nationals from being able to look at data related to that. If you're working in a situation where you may or you're going to be handling that data, you're going to want to make sure that your database provider has that certification. And lastly, you may find that some platforms, Relativity has like their orange level certification, or that the platforms themselves might have some proprietary certifications that they give to vendors that demonstrate that those vendors have met certain requirements in terms of how well they can process data and certain other metrics. Next, we're going to talk about, when you're evaluating these platforms, looking at the pricing. Finding pricing on these platforms can be particularly challenging to try and make what I would call an apples-to-apples comparison, specifically because many times what you're going to be getting here is a rate chart, and you're not going to have potentially a price out of what your total project price is going to be, or you may have it based off of a particular assumption of inputs by the vendor or based on what you gave them. But some of the things that you should look at here are your one-time charges versus your recurrent charges. Your one-time charges are charges for intake of data or for production of data. Recurrent charges are going to be monthly fees, potentially for storage and for user licenses, as well as potentially project management rates. So the most effective way that I found to compare these bids from different platforms is to create a model based on certain assumptions. Try and determine what your expected data volume is going to be, try to figure out what the expected duration of your case is going to be, and try to figure out how many users you're going to expect to have in the database at any one time in terms of the number of licenses that you may potentially charge for. And here, the one-time charges that we mentioned that you're going to be looking at are going to be processing charges to convert the data to a searchable one and potentially load to a database form. Upload charges, and these might relate to just the intake of the data to potentially render it into a searchable form to apply keywords or other ECA type activities. You may see analytics charges around using some of the TAR techniques that we're going to talk later that are on a gigabyte basis, as well as other data analytics that you may want to apply to your data set. And there may be export or production charges related to taking documents out of the database if you ultimately do make productions to another side or a regulatory entity. Some of the recurring charges that we mentioned a little bit already, hosting fees, you might see fees on a monthly basis based on gigabytes on the size of the database that you're maintaining. User fees based on how many people have access to your database or have credentials on it. And project management charges for, there may be hourly charges associated with having your database administrator help you perform certain tasks, including some of the one-time charges, or those may also be priced into the one-time charges. So when you're going to take those assumptions and apply them, you're going to find that which vendor is cheaper may depend on the type of case that you have. For example, here we're going to go through a little hypothetical with, you may have vendor A here who has lower processing charges but has higher monthly fees, and you may have vendor B which has higher processing charges but has lower monthly fees. And then if you're going to apply those two vendors to two different projects, for example, if you have a project that you expect there to be a high volume of data but a short duration, things that come to mind here are maybe an FTC second request or things like that, where you're going to be processing large amounts of data, but you only expect the matter to last a few months before it's potentially concluded. And secondly, you may have, let's look at a hypothetical project 2, where you expect a low amount of data, but you expect an extended duration. It could be a long product liability suit or something like that, where you're expecting to have this not as much data, but that you're going to need to potentially access this data over a period of months or years. So when you take those assumptions and you apply them to the charges of vendor A and vendor B, in this scenario, you might find that vendor A is going to be less expensive for project 1 because it has those lower processing charges on your high volume of data, and even though it has higher monthly fees, because your project's not expected to be that long, those fees may not add up to exceed the savings that you're going to get off those processing charges. And in contrast here, maybe vendor B here is going to be less expensive for project 2, because while there are higher processing charges, because we're expecting this case to persist for several months or a longer period of time, the lower monthly fees are going to maybe make that the better decision in terms of total costs of the matter. So once you've selected a vendor and you're going to move forward with processing your data and loading it to a database, you're going to need to make several decisions around your processing specifications. A lot of these choices I would encourage you to make carefully and to think through, because once made, they are difficult to undo. One of these choices is going to be the time zone that your data is processed in. I would recommend using the time zone that's the location of the key custodians or events that are going to be at issue in your matter. I have worked with clients before where they have attempted to standardize their time zones across all their matters regardless of where they took place. And this particular client had selected the East Coast time zone of the United States as its the time zone that all its data was going to be processed in. And we had an employment matter that we were working with them on that was based on the West Coast, and it made depositions and exhibits, more difficult because you have all these emails that look like they took place either, late at night or early in the morning because of the time shift from the East Coast to the West Coast time zone, even though the custodians that are issue, were in the West Coast time zone the whole time because of the time zone choice that had been made for processing the data. So something to consider carefully here. There are a number of document-specific specifications that you can determine how you want particular documents processed into the database. For example, with Microsoft Word documents, whether or not you want to display the markups feature where it's been used in terms of the images that are created to show changes, the potential author of those changes, and the if there are comments or that as well. If you're familiar with the product, you can either see the final markup where those changes are hidden and it just shows you a final product, or you can look at the draft where you are able to see who changed what, when, and where. Obviously, potentially, you're going to want to look at those because they are included in the native and determine it can affect privilege determinations in part if there are attorneys involved in making these markups of that as well. So it's an important choice to make there. PowerPoint often will have the decision to be made of whether or not you want to display the speaker notes in the slides, or if the slides are going to just process out as the full PowerPoint presentation as just each slide having a sheet of paper. There's an option to consider there in terms of that that's data that is potentially going to be hidden if you don't select to display those notes. Similarly, Excel obviously has the ability to hide whole spreadsheets or to hide cells within a spreadsheet. Often not done for nefarious purposes, just to make spreadsheets easier to look at and to work with. But when you're coming through and reviewing them later, the existence of these hidden cells might be missed by either attorneys reviewing it or contract attorneys reviewing it, and so sometimes you can select to have these hidden cells expanded as part of the processing, so that they're going to be visible in that image in that default, and that should facilitate your ability to review that data. Similarly, you can have entire files embedded in some of these Word documents or these Office documents, and you may want to make the decision to have those files extracted and then processed as well as part of the document processing. And lastly, when you're dealing with processing, there's going to be a number of problem and exception files or files that you may not need to deal with. Typically, you can denist your collection or your data that you're processing. The NIST files are non-user data files. They don't contain any information or that was created by an end user. They are essentially working files of the programs on the computer. Those can typically be removed from your production and don't need to be processed out anyway. You may have to deal with some unsupported formats. I think most often where I've encountered this is in maybe construction or design cases where there are schematics or plans or that are captured on a computer-assisted design platform or CAD drawing. Most often, most of your review platforms are not going to support processing and reviewing these CAD drawings. You're going to need to review them outside of the platform. So that's something to keep in mind if you're going to expect that data in a case you're working on. Audio and video files, as I talked a little bit about before, these files aren't keyword searchable or indexable in their native state, and so as a result, you may, to the extent this content exists, you might have a hard time filtering it. Also, video files especially have the luxury of potentially being large in terms of the volume that they are occupying too, in terms of gigabytes, and so you may want to make decisions about whether or not you want to go ahead and process these files, or if you can conclude that they're not going to be relevant because they are going to be difficult to search or filter out. You may run into encrypted files that have been protected by the user that you've collected from. Hopefully, you're going to be in a position to go back to the user and determine what those encryption passwords might be so that you can look at that content. And you may come in contact with corrupted files or virus-infected files that can't be processed either because they were corrupted either as part of the collection process or in advance, and you're not going to be able to look at that. The key here is to try and determine how many files there are. It's routine to find some that can't be resolved. However, if you encounter a vast number of them, you may get questions from your opponent about if the corruption actually occurred as part of your collection process and your processing, as opposed to where the data sat in the client's files, and you may want to investigate whether or not you can resolve those corruptions. Another processing specification that's important, we're going to dive into a little deeper because it does have some real consequence in your database, deduplication. Before we talk about deduplication, I think it's helpful to talk a little bit about what is a duplicate document, because it's actually, as many things, is more complicated than you might think. So a duplicate document is an identical copy of an electronic file, but most processing software determines that a document is a duplicate not based on a hash value, which is a unique electronic signature on a file. So every file has this unique value, essentially a digital fingerprint that will help you keep track of which files are really the exact same or which ones are not. An important thing to consider here that these software platforms do is deduplication should be applied at a family level and not at a document level. And what this means is that a document's family relationship, or whether or not a document is attached to another document, most common is an email and an attachment, is considered when you determine if a document is a duplicate or not. So I may have a Word file that I have on my hard drive on its own that's a standalone file, and then I've also attached that file to an email that I send. Well, it's not a quote-unquote duplicate file for purposes of processing here, even though that's the exact same file, because in one situation that file is attached to an email, and the other point it is just a file on its own. So we're going to consider, or the software is going to consider those to be two separate documents, even though they would actually have the same hash value. So the deduplication software, as I just mentioned, is going to consider a file a duplicate if it has the same hash value and it has the same family relationship. So some examples here to try and illustrate how this works. That standalone Word document and attached to an email, they have the same hash values, but they are not in the same family relationship. So software would not consider it a duplicate. It would not remove that document in either instance. An email that exists in two different locations that have the same hash value and the same family relationship. So perhaps an email from me to another custodian, and I have two copies of it. I have one in the custodian's collection who received it and one in my collection from sending it. Those are the same files. They have the same hash value. They have the same family relationship. Software will consider those to be duplicates. And the last example here is you may have an Excel file on your hard drive that has the same name as one on a server that you shared, but the hard drive file has been modified more recently. That's going to change the hash value of that document. And so those are, even though they have the same name, the computer is going to consider them the processing engine is going to consider them to be not to be duplicate documents. So once the processing software goes through and determines what are duplicates and what are not, there's different ways that you can treat those documents. First one we'll talk about is what's called global or horizontal deduplication, kind of fastly becoming the most common deduplication, in part because it's going to give you the biggest reduction in the database. So in global deduplication, only a single instance of each file, and it's going to be the first one that's processed, is going to be kept at a family level in the database. So for example, if I have an email that was sent by one custodian to 3 other custodians, I may have 4 separate copies of that email or more even that are all identical because I have the sender's copy and I have the 3 recipients' copy. The database is going to remove 3 of those versions. It will generally populate a field, another custodian field, with the names of the custodians who it removes it from, so that you know that you did have it as part of their collection, but you're only going to have 1 document enter the database, 1 instance of it. Usually it will be the one that was processed first in terms of the database. So one thing to keep in mind here is you may want to make sure that you're processing data from your key custodians first, so that most of the documents are, have their quote-unquote home within that custodian's collection. This is going to give you the biggest reduction, obviously, in terms of deduplication, because you are going to eliminate all duplicate documents from the database. One thing to keep in mind here for the global deduplication is that in order for this to be effective, all the data is going to need to be run through the same processor, the same processing entity is going to have to handle it, because that's how the deduplication standard is going to be applied. We'll talk a little bit later about what can happen if you have different data processed by different processors, and when you load it all into the same database, your global deduplication is not going to be effective. So your second choice here potentially is per custodian or vertical deduplication. It's a little different here because you're going to remove duplicate documents within each custodian's collection, but multiple instances of that file will be kept in the database to the extent it exists among each custodian. So the same scenario I had before, where I have 4 copies of an email because I have 1 custodian that sent it, and it was sent to 3 other custodians. And under the per custodian or vertical deduplication, all 4 copies of that are going to be kept because it's going to be 1 in each custodian's file. Now, to the extent that there are more than 1 copy within a custodian, so if the sender, for whatever reason, we have 2 or 3 copies of that email because maybe it was on a laptop we collected from, and maybe it was on an Outlook server that we collected from as well, those copies within the same custodian's collection are going to be removed. And I suggest using this type of deduplication where your data is going to be processed by different processors, because that's how you're going to be able to apply it. The global deduplication is not going to work. You're not going to be able to get rid of all these other instances because if the data is processed in 2 different locations, I won't know that there was an instance in the other location. And the confusion that can result from using the global deduplication, if you are processing different locations, is it is going to be effective within data that was processed in the same location. So if I have custodian 1 and 2 were processed at the same place in the same software, they will dedupe fully against each other. But then if custodian 3 is added from another processing location or was processed separately and is now being loaded into the database, then they would not dedupe against custodian 1 or 2, and I'm going to have a confusing situation where I think my database has been globally deduped, and yet I still have multiple instances of some documents. If you understand that can happen, it can be dealt with, but I think you're better off making a choice where you're not going to have those inconsistencies. And obviously, your last choice here potentially is to not deduplicate. You're going to have all your documents will be loaded, all their duplicates. That's going to be the largest number of documents in the database. It can present a number of challenges doing this, besides the fact you're going to have more volume, obviously. If you're trying to code documents consistently, if you have multiple instances of the same document, and you have different decision makers coding those documents, and even the same decision maker sometimes, it may be hard for them to be coded identically. You may have situations, though, I've certainly worked with certain government entities that have insisted that they do not want data deduplicated in any way before it is sent to them. You may still want to, there are essentially ways to deduplicate data and then repopulate the duplicates at the end. But you may be in a position where you are required by the case of the entity that you're working with to not deduplicate data, in which case you may be compelled to use this option. Next, we're going to talk briefly about reducing data sets once you have the data deduplicated and processed. One of the age-old and tried and true forms here is applying search terms to data, particular keywords, and only promoting documents that contain those terms into the review database. Key here when you're using search terms is going to be that you make sure that you've tested these. A few tips here: avoid what I would call result-based selections. This would be where you run some potential search terms, and based on the number of hits you get back, you determine that a search term is good or bad because it either hits on too many terms or hits on too few terms, or in the Goldilocks scenario here, it maybe hits just right in terms of the amount of hits you're expecting. Obviously, there's very little defensibility if you're picking search terms solely based on the number of hits that they're yielding. I often use the 6th grade term paper example. You don't want it to be too thick or too thin, so you're going to try and tweak your search terms there. Things that can affect your search terms: be careful about using expanders. So expanders are going to be a character at the end of a word that will help you, catch presumably different forms of the same word, or whether, for example, for past tense or other ways for verbs or things like that. But if you use it on a small word that may have lots of expansions that you haven't thought about, you can potentially explode your search results by inadvertently bringing in all these other terms as search terms, because the word you use can be expanded to many different terms. Another tactic here, if you do have common words in your search terms, if you, I have seen situations where you're dealing with product names where the company has used very common names or that for its products, and so you have to use the search term because you obviously need to search for the product that may be an issue in the case. But hopefully you can potentially pair that word with another word using an and connector to potentially reduce false hits or reduce picking up other meanings of the same word. You can use concept searches sometimes if they're available. That's very helpful. So this is using some of the analytics features of these platforms, where it will take words that you're searching for, and it will find other similar words that appear in those documents. This is a way that you may be able to find developmental names of products or things like that, as opposed to names they were marked under or marketed under, and other words that you may not have been aware of in the outset that were going to be in documents that you're going to consider relevant, but that you can use these concepts to determine those and refine your search term set based on them. Make sure that when you're looking at your hit counts that you're looking at unique hits and total hits, and understand the difference between those types of lists. A unique hit is going to show you your search terms, and it's going to show the number of documents that hit only on that one term. So it's important when you see that to realize that if you were to alter or change that term, that's the documents that are actually going to be affected by doing that. Total hit lists are going to show you the number of documents that each word in the search list, each keyword hits on. It will not demonstrate where there's you'll be able to see that there's overlap because the unique hits are going to be different from the total hits on documents. And so that difference is explained by there may be documents, and ideally that there are, if you're using good search terms, that are hitting on more than one of your search terms. And so understand when you're looking at your document counts, which of those two types of lists you're looking at when you're making your decision. And again, a topic here that could be exploded into its own separate seminar is you may want to negotiate these search terms with your opponent. There are advantages and disadvantages to that. The advantage can be, you achieve some limits on your potential discovery and challenges to your discovery if you have agreed with the other side on the list you're going to use, in terms of that they won't be able to say, well, you didn't do a good enough job, or you didn't search well enough. You're like, in the defense of, well, I searched all the words that you and I agreed on. The flip side of that can be you are letting them into your discovery kitchen a little bit in terms of seeing exactly what your efforts are and what you're undertaking to find documents. You may have terms that you want to use that you want to keep confidential because they potentially reveal theories of the case that the defense or the other side might not be aware of yet. They may potentially clue them into other potential causes of actions or things like that. And so this is certainly a tactic you can undertake, but should be considered before doing so. A last decision here with search terms can be, are you going to apply these at processing to limit what's performed into the platform itself, or what's promoted, or in the platform after processing? The reason to consider this here is if your search terms change, or that you may need, or if you're worried about them changing, you may need to pay however you're processing the data, or whoever processes your data, fees to keep that data available and potentially to go back and pull terms out of it if terms are added or tweaked in some way, where you will though be able to limit the volume of data that's in your database. However, if you promote everything up to the database, then you're going to be able to just change terms easily because the data is already there, and you're going to be able to see how adding or changing terms affects the total count of documents that you're going to potentially need to look at. Lastly, we'll talk a little bit about ECA tools, or early case assessment tools. Essentially, an ECA tool is something that's going to let you review or processing documents prior to doing full processing in them. Now, initially, these came as ways to limit your processing costs by kind of, seeing what the results of actual search terms would be, or concepts of that, so that you can kind of preview how many documents would be promoted to your database if you used certain terms or concepts. The limits to these tools often, sometimes you're only looking at extracted text from these documents, and you're not seeing the full text of the document itself, or certainly how it's presented, or if there's any, you can't see the formatting or objects that might be included in pictures or things like that. So it's kind of still a preview window into the document. I personally found these tools kind of limited usefulness going forward for a couple of reasons. First of all, a lot of times at this point people are calling it collection, in which case the data set, by the time you get to this ECA tool, has already been culled as much as you want to before you load it to the database, and so you're not going to actually use this. And secondly, the advent of lower processing costs have made the time or cost that might be associated with using an ECA tool less of a savings potentially to that. And again, as we kind of discussed a few times before, if you potentially have to go back and add search terms or data at some point, it may be cheaper at this point just to push that data through and load it to the database rather than needing to keep it around, just potentially search it again, go back and add some processing later. And lastly, kind of our whirlwind tour today, we're going to talk about technology-assisted review. And there are obviously many webinars or other seminars devoted solely to these tools and how you can use them and use them effectively effectively. So what I'm going to give you today is a very high overview of some of the processes that are out there that can be used potentially to help you limit your data set. So one of the first techniques that may use consistently is categorization. That's where documents are going to be placed and categorized as likely responsive or likely not responsive, or uncategorized. This process involves coding C sets of documents as part of a subsection of the whole a field of documents, taking those decisions, having the computer go out and apply its algorithm to the non-reviewed documents and seeing if it can categorize the documents that are out there based on similarities to the ones you did code as likely responsive or likely not. You're going to repeat this for several cycles, typically maybe 5 or 6 rounds, until stabilization is achieved, and that's achieved when the computer is telling you that now, even though you're coding additional documents, it's not affecting the categorization of the other documents. They're not shifting between being likely responsive or not anymore, that they are, to the extent that they can be categorized, they have. And then what you can do is you can take the results of this categorization process and limit your review of documents to those as identified as likely responsive. Another technique to use here is domain parsing. It's going to have several different advantages to it. The first is, well, just defining what it is, categorizing emails based on their sender or recipient domain. So you can take the emails that are in your database and identify where they were sent from or to, and have a domain list of those .com or .org or .gov or whatever addresses they have been sent from. This can be helpful to remove junk domains if you don't have good filtering on that, so you can quickly remove emails that you know aren't going to be relevant, that are newsletters or automated, or they're just not going to have relevant information, so they're just clogging up your database and your process. You can pull those out. Another use for this tool can be to help identify law firm domains quickly, to identify privilege. I think one of the best ways to identify a document as privilege is that it is either sent to or from a company's lawyer's domain. Those tend to be reliably privileged, 9 times out of 10, if not 99 out of 100. And so using this tool to electronically identify those is a great way, potentially also to identify lawyers that you may not be aware of that are in the database. Certainly with a firm the size of my firm in that, you may have situations where there are maybe 2 or 3 lawyers that typically email a client, and you may be aware of their names at the outset of a case, search for them and locate them. But there may be any number of other lawyers or legal assistants or paralegals that may have contacted this client on a one-off basis, or that you're not aware of at the outset. And using the email domain of the messages is a good way to find those actors and identify them and make sure that you're picking up all of your privileged communications. A last tool that I think is very effective in this area is conversation threading of emails. What this tool does is it will organize emails into conversation threads, so it will take all different pieces of email back and forth, which can be both just a single conversation back and forth between a group of people, but may also branch off if there are other people that reply to subsets of the group or that include that message or that as well. What this is going to allow you to do is to limit the review of your emails to what are called inclusive emails, cutting the total number of documents you have to look at. So if I have a chain of 7 or 8 emails where the email has gone back and forth with the same set of recipients, and the text is included all the way down for the whole chain, what the database is going to do, it's going to identify that last in time email, the 8th email of that, and you can then just review that one and code all the way down, or review it all the way down and see the prior 7 messages, and then make your coding decision based off of the reviewing that one document and apply it to all the emails that are in that chain without reviewing them further. One key thing that I think a lot of the attorneys that I work with here sometimes confuse conversation threading with deduplication. Conversation threading is just a way of organizing messages within the database, where deduplication is actually controlling what documents make it into the database. So importantly, in conversation threading, you're just organizing these records in a particular fashion. You are not actually removing the non-inclusive emails from the database. You are merely removing them from your review set. So that is the end of my time here today and a whirlwind tour of some decisions that you can make early on in your case that are going to affect and set you up for success in the e-discovery practice. So thank you guys very much for attending, and I will turn it back over to our host.
Thank you, Andrew. That was a great session focused on the best practices you can implement early in the e-discovery process that will help you speed review for your next case. You know, when Andrew discussed platform evaluation, he touched on some of the questions you should be asking potential providers with regard to features, cost, and security. Regarding features, he mentioned logic coding rules, automated workflows, and integrated translation capabilities. These are all core components of the LexB e-discovery platform. If you'd like to see this firsthand, we'd be happy to schedule a demonstration for you and your colleagues. Please email me for more information. You'll find my contact information at the end of the broadcast. When it comes to pricing, LexB is often rated as one of the most cost-effective e-discovery solutions on the market. We have a straightforward pricing model that is calculated on a per gig basis. One important point, we do not charge user fees. You can add as many users as you like and it will not affect your rate. Andrew mentioned user fees several times, and he did so because with many of our competitors, the initial price quote you receive may not include the additional licenses you will need for your review team. That can be a huge hidden cost, but again, with LexB, it is never a charge you will incur. Some of the other costs he mentioned include processing, upload, and analysis. LexB is purpose-built for DIY e-discovery, so you can actually perform those functions yourself within our platform and avoid unnecessary charges. Our pricing plans are flexible to meet the needs of you and your clients. We offer ingestion-based pricing, a month-to-month plan with no commitment, as well as subscriptions that are discounted based on the amount of data and the length of the term. Finally, LexB only uses the strongest security when managing your case data. We transmit and store your ESI using strong 256-bit encryption, the same technology used by leading financial institutions. Additionally, our data centers have achieved ISO 27001 certification, which Andrew mentioned is crucial when he discussed data security. With that, I want to thank all of you for joining us today. I'm going to ask one final polling question before ending the webinar, and that is, would you like a demonstration of the LexB e-discovery platform? While you're answering that, thank you everybody for attending today's session. After this webinar, we'll be making available a recorded streaming version, an MP3 podcast, and a PDF of the slide deck. If you have any questions or would like a follow-up consultation or demonstration of the software, please contact me. You can see my contact information on the screen. Thanks again, everybody, for attending, and thanks again to Andrew Hansel for being our guest speaker in this month's webinar. There's a brief survey at the end of the session. We'd greatly appreciate your feedback. And watch your inboxes for an invite to our next webinar on best practices in e-discovery. Thank you.